Welcome to our channel, Crime Loom, the place where true crime stories come alive. The town was small and quiet, surrounded by deep and endless woods. People lived simple lives, and nothing ever seemed to change. But one cold evening, everything felt different. A shadow was seen moving between the trees. It was tall, silent, and unknown. No one knew who it was or why it was there. Whispers began to spread. Some said it was a traveler lost in the forest. Others believed it was someone dangerous hiding from the law. Fear started to grow in the hearts of the townsfolk. Children were kept inside, doors were locked early, and every sound in the night made people uneasy. The stranger in the woods was no longer just a rumor. It was real. And soon the mystery would shake the whole town. The town of Pine Hollow was small and peaceful. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names, and the loudest noise at night was the sound of crickets in the summer. The town sat at the edge of a wide forest, a forest that was so thick and dark that people rarely went in too far. Children were told never to wander off the path, and hunters always kept close to the open trails. The woods were quiet most of the time, but sometimes, when the wind blew just right, the trees seemed to whisper. One autumn evening, a hunter named Carl was walking home after checking his traps. The sun had already slipped behind the trees, and the sky was painted orange and purple. Carl carried his rifle on his shoulder and whistled to himself as he followed the narrow path. But then he stopped. On the ground before him were footprints. They were fresh, pressed deep into the damp soil. He bent down and studied them carefully. They didn't look like animal tracks. They were human footprints. At first, he thought they might belong to another hunter, but something was off. The size of the prints was strange, larger than a child's, yet smaller than most men's. The steps were uneven, almost as if the person was limping or moving with caution. Carl felt a chill run through him. He had hunted these woods for years and knew the signs of every creature, but these tracks were different. Someone had been here, and they weren't supposed to be. When Carl returned to town, he stopped at the local diner. The diner was the heart of Pine Hollow, a place where people gathered to eat, talk, and share news. He told a few men at the counter about the footprints. At first, they laughed and said it was probably some drifter passing through. But when Carl explained how fresh the tracks looked, their smiles faded. "Could be nothing," one man muttered, sipping his coffee. "But it's strange, I'll give you that." By the next morning, the story had already spread. People whispered about a stranger in the woods. Some thought it was just nonsense, but others felt uneasy. The town was small and strangers were rare. If someone new had come, people would have noticed. 2 nights later, a woman named Mrs. Harper, who lived at the very edge of town, claimed she heard someone outside her house. Her dog barked wildly, scratching at the door, and when she looked out the window, she saw a shadow moving near the trees. It wasn't an animal. It was tall, human, and silent. Mrs. Harper told the sheriff the next day. Sheriff Doyle was a calm man, not quick to believe rumors, but he knew the people of Pine Hollow well. Mrs. Harper wasn't one to make up stories. He decided to take a small group of deputies to walk the edge of the forest that evening. As they moved between the trees, the light of their flashlights cut across the darkness. The woods were still, too still, as if holding its breath. They found nothing but the sound of leaves crunching under their boots. But just as they were about to head back, one deputy spotted something near an old oak tree. It was a fire pit. The ashes were cold, but the rocks around it were blackened with smoke. Someone had been living there, hiding in the woods only a short walk from the town. The sheriff stood silently, his jaw tight. "Somebody's out here," he said in a low voice. "And they don't want to be found." Word of the discovery spread like wildfire through Pine Hollow. Parents pulled their children inside early. Locks were checked twice at night. People began to look over their shoulders when walking home. The stranger in the woods was no longer just a rumor. It was real. Carl, the hunter, felt uneasy. One evening, he went back to the woods, curious to see if he could find more signs. He carried his lantern and rifle and followed the trail deeper into the trees. After an hour, he saw something hanging on a branch. It was a piece of cloth, torn and dirty, caught on the bark. He pulled it free and looked at it under the lantern's glow. It was part of a jacket. The fabric was old, worn thin. Carl folded it carefully and stuffed it into his bag. He planned to take it to the sheriff in the morning, but as he turned to leave, he felt something that made his blood run cold. Someone was watching him. He couldn't see them, but he could feel eyes on him, hidden in the shadows between the trees. His chest tightened, and his fingers gripped the rifle tighter. Slowly, he backed away, never taking his eyes off the dark woods. He didn't run, but his steps grew quicker until the lights of town appeared ahead. That night, Carl barely slept. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside made him sit up in bed. The image of the dark woods, the unseen watcher, stayed with him. The sheriff took the torn jacket seriously. He placed it on his desk and studied it. "Someone's been here for a while," he said. "This isn't just a traveler passing through. Whoever it is, they've been living in these woods." The mystery deepened when news came from a nearby town. A man had gone missing 2 weeks earlier. His description was vague, but it matched what little was known of the stranger. Could it be the same person? For Pine Hollow, life was no longer simple and safe. The woods that once seemed ordinary now felt full of secrets. Every shadow held a question. Every noise in the night carried fear. The stranger was out there, watching, waiting, and no one knew what he wanted. Sheriff Doyle was not a man who panicked easily. In his 20 years of service, he had dealt with fights, robberies, and even one unsolved disappearance. But something about this case felt different. It was not just a single crime. It was the unknown. A stranger was living in the woods near his town, and no one knew who he was or what he wanted. That made the sheriff uneasy. The morning after Carl brought him the torn jacket, Doyle gathered his 2 deputies, Reed and Miller, inside the small sheriff's office. The 3 men stood around the desk, staring at the dirty piece of cloth. "Could be the missing man from Fairview," Deputy Reed said, scratching his chin. "Or someone else entirely," Doyle replied. He kept his voice steady, but his mind was racing. The sheriff decided to send word to Fairview, the town 20 miles away, to ask for more details about the missing man. Meanwhile, he told Reed and Miller to patrol the woods again. That same evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, the deputies moved carefully through the trees. Their flashlights swept across branches and bushes. They found more signs: an old can of beans, a piece of rope, and ashes from another fire pit. Whoever the stranger was, he had been living rough for some time. The people of Pine Hollow grew restless. At the diner, in the general store, and even outside the church, everyone was talking about the stranger. Some believed he was a harmless drifter. Others thought he was dangerous, maybe even a wanted criminal hiding from the law. One night, Mrs. Harper's neighbor, Mr. Collins, claimed he saw someone moving in his backyard. He had gone outside to check, but by the time he reached the porch, the figure had already slipped back into the woods. The next morning, he noticed a loaf of bread missing from his kitchen window. The fear spread faster than the facts. Parents warned their children to stay indoors. Shopkeepers closed their doors early. The town that had once been calm now carried an air of tension. Even the sound of the wind moving through the trees made people nervous. Sheriff Doyle tried to keep order. "Don't spread wild stories," he told people. "We're investigating. We'll find out the truth." But in private, he knew they needed answers soon. Fear could turn into anger, and anger could lead to mistakes. A week later, news came back from Fairview. The missing man's name was Daniel Price. He had been 35 years old, a quiet man who worked at a gas station. He was last seen walking home after work. No one knew where he went or why. The sheriff shared this information with the townsfolk, but it brought little comfort. If the stranger was Daniel Price, what was he doing in Pine Hollow's woods? And if it wasn't him, then who was it? One cold evening, something happened that shook the town even more. A young girl named Lucy was walking home with her father after visiting her grandmother. Their path took them along the edge of the forest. Lucy suddenly stopped and pointed at the trees. "Daddy!" she whispered. "Someone's there." Her father turned quickly. At first, he saw nothing but darkness between the branches. But then, just for a second, he caught sight of a figure. A man, tall and thin, standing completely still among the trees. His face was hard to see, but his eyes seemed to glint in the fading light. When the man realized he had been spotted, he stepped back into the shadows and vanished. Lucy's father grabbed her hand and hurried home, his heart pounding. The next morning, he went straight to the sheriff's office to report what he had seen. By now, the town was at its breaking point. Some men suggested forming a group to go into the forest and hunt the stranger down. Others argued they should leave it to the sheriff. Heated arguments broke out at the diner and the gas station. Fear was turning neighbor against neighbor. Sheriff Doyle called a meeting at the town hall. Almost everyone came. He stood at the front of the room, his hat in his hands, and spoke firmly. "I know you're scared. I am too," he admitted. "But we cannot act without thinking. We don't know who this man is. We don't know if he's dangerous. If you go out there with guns and tempers, someone innocent could get hurt. Let me and my deputies do our job." The room was silent for a long moment. Then an older man spoke. "Sheriff, we trust you. But don't let this drag on too long. We got families to protect." The sheriff nodded. He knew they were right. That night, Doyle and his deputies set up a watch near the forest. They sat quietly in the dark, their eyes scanning the tree line. Hours passed with nothing but the sound of crickets. Just when Doyle began to think it was another fruitless night, he saw movement. A shadow slipped between the trees. It was a man, no doubt about it. His shoulders were hunched, his clothes ragged, and his steps quick, like he was used to hiding. Doyle held up his hand, signaling his deputies to stay still. The figure moved closer to the edge of the woods, glanced around, and then darted toward one of the houses. Before Doyle could act, the man had disappeared into the darkness again. The sheriff clenched his jaw. The stranger was bold. He wasn't just hiding anymore, he was watching the town, moving closer each night. The next morning, the sheriff walked through town, speaking to the people directly. "Keep your doors locked. Keep food inside. And if you see him, don't try to confront him. Call me immediately." But even as he gave his warnings, Doyle knew things were changing. The stranger was no longer just a mystery. He was a threat. And the worst part was, Doyle felt sure the man wasn't only hiding in the woods. He was waiting for something no one in Pine Hollow was ready for. The days passed slowly, and the town of Pine Hollow could not escape its fear. Every sound in the night felt sharper. Every shadow seemed alive. People whispered about the stranger, and no one felt safe anymore. Sheriff Doyle kept his deputies busy, but even he knew they were chasing a ghost. The man in the woods was clever. He left behind small traces, an empty can, a faint footprint, or the ashes of a fire, but never enough to catch him. It was like he wanted them to know he was there, yet never be able to reach him. Then, strange events began to happen. It started with food. A loaf of bread disappeared from Mrs. Harper's kitchen window. Chickens went missing from Mr. Collins's coop. A bag of apples was taken from the market stall one night. At first, people thought it might be wild animals, but the signs were too clear. Someone had broken in carefully, taking only what they needed, but then things grew more unsettling. Dogs barked wildly at the edge of the woods, their fur standing on end as if they smelled something unnatural. Children claimed to see a man watching them from between the trees when they played outside. A farmer's wife swore she saw a face at her window late one evening, staring in with cold, hollow eyes. The sheriff listened to every report, but the details were always the same. A shadow, a tall figure, someone who vanished before they could get a good look. It was enough to keep the whole town awake at night. One evening, Carl the hunter decided to check his traps near the forest again. As he walked the trail, he noticed something unusual. A rabbit he had caught was gone, the trap sprung open. At first, he thought maybe another animal had stolen it, but then he noticed something else. A footprint in the mud, fresh, clear. The man had been here not long ago. Carl's heart raced. He lifted his rifle and looked around. The trees were silent, the air heavy. He had the strong feeling he was not alone. Slowly, he began to back away, but then he heard it, a faint snapping sound, like a twig breaking underfoot. Someone was following him. Carl turned quickly but saw nothing. His hands shook as he hurried down the path. By the time he reached town, sweat covered his forehead and his voice trembled as he told the sheriff what had happened. Sheriff Doyle frowned. "He's watching us," he said. "He knows when we're close." The next day, the sheriff organized another search party. This time, more men from the town joined in. They carried lanterns, rifles, and knives, their faces grim with determination. Some were tired of being afraid. They wanted to catch the stranger and end the mystery once and for all. The men spread out through the woods, searching every path, every clearing. For hours, they found nothing. But just as the group was about to return, one of the deputies called out, "Sheriff! Over here!" The men gathered around. There, hidden beneath the roots of an old oak tree, was a small camp. It was nothing more than a blanket, a tin cup, and a pile of leaves, but it was proof that the stranger had been living there. More disturbing were the objects they found tucked into a corner. Old newspaper clippings, torn and yellowed. Sheriff Doyle picked one up and held it to the light of his lantern. The headline made his stomach tighten. Unsolved Crime Shocks Fairview. The article was about a robbery and a man who had vanished years ago. Doyle's eyes moved quickly over the words. It didn't give much detail, but it mentioned a suspect who had never been caught. Another clipping spoke about a missing child from a nearby town. A third talked about a burglary where the thief disappeared into the night. All of them were old, but all pointed to the same thing. The stranger was not just a wanderer. He had a past. The sheriff folded the clippings carefully and put them into his coat. He knew better than to share them with the townsfolk just yet. Fear was already high. If people believed the stranger was tied to old crimes, panic could turn violent. But the men who stood around him that night could see it in his face. The mystery was deeper than they thought. As the search party headed back, the forest felt heavier, darker. The stranger was no longer just stealing food. He had a reason to be here, and whatever it was connected to those old crimes. That night, as the sheriff sat in his office, the wind rattling the windows, he thought about Daniel Price, the missing man from Fairview. Could the stranger be him? Or was it someone else entirely? Someone who had been running for years, hiding in the shadows of towns like Pine Hollow. The sheriff's thoughts were interrupted when the office door burst open. Deputy Miller rushed in, his face pale. "Sheriff," he said breathlessly, "we just got a call." "The Collins barn is on fire!" The sheriff leapt to his feet. "What happened?" "No one knows. Mr. Collins says he saw a figure running into the woods right before the fire started." The sheriff grabbed his hat and ran out into the night. The barn was already engulfed in flames, the fire crackling and spitting sparks into the sky. Neighbors rushed with buckets of water, but the building was beyond saving. The glow of the fire lit up the edge of the forest, and for a moment Doyle thought he saw something move among the trees. A figure, standing still, watching. When he blinked, it was gone. The sheriff's jaw tightened as he watched the barn collapse in flames. This was no longer just about a stranger hiding in the woods. It was about danger, and it was getting closer to town. The fire at Mr. Collins's barn changed everything. Before, the stranger had stolen food and lingered in the shadows. But setting a fire was different. It was bold, dangerous, and it told the town one clear message. Whoever this man was, he was no longer content to hide. For 2 days, the townsfolk of Pine Hollow could talk of nothing else. At the diner, men argued loudly about what to do. Some wanted to form an armed group and search the woods until the stranger was found. Others urged patience, saying the sheriff needed time. But most agreed on one thing. The stranger had crossed a line. Sheriff Doyle sat in his office, staring at the stack of newspaper clippings they had found in the forest camp. His hand rubbed the edge of his jaw as he thought. He had not told anyone about the clippings yet. The townsfolk were already restless. If they knew the stranger might be tied to old crimes, their fear would explode into anger. Deputy Reed stepped into the office. "Sheriff," he said, his voice low, "people are gathering at the town hall again. They want answers." Doyle sighed and stood. "Then I'll give them what I can." That evening, the hall was packed. Faces were tense, voices were raised, and the room was hot with frustration. Doyle raised his hand for silence. "I know you're angry. I know you're afraid. But listen," he said firmly. "We are dealing with a man who is clever and careful. He knows these woods and he knows how to stay hidden. If we rush in without thought, we risk more lives, more damage. I promise you this, we will catch him, but we have to do it the right way." A farmer at the back shouted, "The right way won't keep our families safe." Others nodded in agreement. The sheriff's words calmed some, but not all. The divide in the town was growing. That night, Doyle walked home through the quiet streets. The air was cold, and the moon hung low above the forest. He felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. This was no longer just about catching a stranger, it was about holding his town together. The next morning, the sheriff decided to return to the woods with his deputies. They followed the trail deeper than before, moving carefully, listening for every sound. After an hour, they came across something new, a shack hidden among the trees. It was small, made from old wood and covered in leaves and moss to blend with the forest. The door creaked when Doyle pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled of smoke and damp earth. The shack was simple but unsettling. There was a blanket on the floor, a lantern, and cans stacked in the corner. On a small table lay a notebook, its pages filled with rough writing. Doyle picked it up and flipped through the pages. Most of the words made little sense, scribbles, fragments, names, and dates. But a few phrases stood out. They don't know. I see them every night. It's not over. Doyle closed the book slowly. His stomach tightened. This was not just a drifter. This man had been watching Pine Hollow for weeks, maybe longer. As the sheriff and his deputies searched the shack, they found more newspaper clippings, some about crimes years old. One clipping showed a face, a grainy picture of Daniel Price, the missing man from Fairview. Doyle held it up, staring at the eyes. Could this be him? Miller asked quietly. Maybe, Doyle said. But why come here? Why now? Before they could search further, a noise outside made them freeze. A branch snapped. Footsteps. Someone was out there. The sheriff motioned for silence. They crept to the door and peered outside, but the woods were still. Only the wind moved through the branches. Let's go, Doyle whispered. He could be close. Back in town, Doyle locked the notebook and clippings in his office drawer. He told no one about the shack, not yet. The town's fear was already close to boiling over. If word spread too soon, there might be chaos. That night, fear became real again. Mrs. Harper's little girl woke screaming, saying she had seen a man's face at her bedroom window. When the sheriff arrived, he found footprints in the dirt below the window, fresh ones leading back into the woods. The town could not take much more. Men stood on their porches with rifles, women pulled their curtains tight, and children whispered about the stranger like he was a monster from a storybook. At the diner, Carl the Hunter leaned across the counter and spoke in a low voice. Sheriff, I think I know who he is. Years ago, there was a man connected to a crime in Fairview. He vanished. Folks said he might still be alive, hiding somewhere. I think he's come back. Doyle's heart sank. The clippings, the strange writings, the sightings, it all pointed to one truth. The stranger wasn't just passing through. He had history, and it was tied to crimes long buried. That evening, the sheriff sat at his desk long after the town had gone quiet. He pulled out the notebook from the shack and read through the scribbles again. One line made him stop. The woods keep my secrets. They can't find what I buried. His hand tightened around the book. Buried. The word echoed in his mind. What had the stranger hidden out there? Before he could think further, a sound outside the office window made him look up. For a brief moment, he saw movement, a tall shadow slipping away into the night. The stranger had been there. Watching him, Sheriff Doyle's pulse quickened. The game had changed. The stranger was no longer just hiding in the woods. He was circling closer and closer to the people of Pine Hollow, and it was only a matter of time before he struck again. The stranger was no longer a whisper in Pine Hollow. He had become a shadow that followed every step of the town. By now, everyone locked their doors before the sun went down. Even the children stopped playing outside, their laughter replaced by hushed questions. Who is he? What does he want? Sheriff Doyle spent his nights poring over the notebook from the shack. The words inside were broken and strange, but certain lines troubled him. One page read, "They forgot, but I remember." Another said, "The woods are mine." The most chilling note repeated the same word over and over. Guilt. Deputy Reed leaned over Doyle's shoulder one evening. "He's obsessed with something," Reed muttered. "Not something," Doyle corrected. Someone. Or some crime. The sheriff decided it was time to dig deeper into the past. He contacted Fairview again, requesting more records on Daniel Price and the robbery that had shaken the town years ago. 2 days later, an envelope arrived. Inside were police reports, photos, and statements. Daniel Price had not been just a gas station worker. Years ago, he had been questioned in connection with a violent robbery. A man was killed during the crime, but Daniel disappeared before the trial. With no proof and no suspect, the case went cold. Doyle studied the photos closely. Daniel's face was thinner in the picture, but the eyes, sharp, restless, were the same as the shadow Lucy's father claimed to have seen. "If this is him," Doyle said quietly, "he's been hiding all these years. And now he's come back." The sheriff didn't tell the townsfolk right away. He needed proof. But the stranger wasn't making it easy. That very night, more strange events shook Pine Hollow. A farmer woke to find his barn door open, hay scattered across the ground, and his tools missing. Another family discovered their cellar broken into, jars of food taken. These weren't random acts anymore. They were steps closer to the heart of the town. Then came something darker. At dawn, Carl the hunter found something nailed to a tree near the edge of the woods. It was the torn piece of cloth, the same fabric he had found weeks before, but now it had words scrawled across it in charcoal. "I'm still here." Carl's hands trembled as he showed it to the sheriff. The message was clear. The stranger wasn't just surviving in the woods anymore. He was playing a game. Doyle called another meeting at the town hall. The people came, their voices rising in anger and fear. "How much longer are we supposed to wait?" shouted one man. "Our families aren't safe," cried a woman. "We should go in there and flush him out." Another yelled. Doyle raised his hands. "I understand your fear, but this man isn't just some drifter. He's dangerous. He knows these woods better than any of us. If we charge in, we'll lose men. Let us handle this." But the room was restless. More and more, the townsfolk wanted to take matters into their own hands. Doyle could feel control slipping away. That night, Doyle returned to the shack with his deputies. They searched the surrounding woods carefully, lanterns in hand. Just as they were about to give up, Miller stumbled on something half buried near a tree. It was a wooden box, worn and rotting. Inside were small objects wrapped in cloth. Doyle unwrapped one carefully and froze. It was a child's shoe, old and dirty. Another bundle contained a silver locket with a picture of a woman inside. A third held a knife with dried, rusted stains along the blade. The men exchanged uneasy looks. "What in God's name?" Miller whispered. Doyle's face was grim. "He's been keeping trophies." The sheriff wrapped the items and carried them back to his office. He didn't sleep that night. The shoe reminded him of the missing child from the old newspaper clippings. The knife could have been from the robbery in Fairview. Each object tied the stranger not only to Pine Hollow, but to crimes across the region. The next morning, Doyle decided the town needed to know at least part of the truth. He stood on the steps of the sheriff's office and addressed the crowd that had gathered. "This man is not a simple drifter," Doyle said firmly. "He is tied to crimes from years ago, serious crimes. That is why he's hiding. That is why he doesn't want to be found. But I promise you this, we will bring him in, and we will uncover the truth." Gasps and whispers filled the air. Some people looked relieved to finally know more, but others looked even more afraid. That evening, Doyle returned to his office to review the notebook again. As he flipped through the pages, he found one he had missed before. It read, "They think the woods are safe. They don't know what lies beneath." Beneath. The word struck him. Did the stranger mean something buried? Something hidden deeper in the forest? Before Doyle could think further, Deputy Reed burst in. His face was pale, his breath short. "Sheriff," he said quickly, "it's Lucy, the Harper girl. She's missing." The sheriff shot to his feet. "When?" "Just an hour ago. Mrs. Harper says she went to feed the chickens. She never came back. They found the coop open and the gate to the woods swinging." Doyle's stomach dropped. The stranger had taken children before. At least that's what the clippings suggested. And now he might have taken one from Pine Hollow. Grabbing his rifle, Doyle gave orders sharply. "Gather every man we can. We go into the woods. Tonight." For the first time, the town's fear turned into fury. Men lit lanterns, shouldered rifles, and followed the sheriff into the dark forest. The time for waiting was over. The stranger had crossed the final line, and now the hunt had begun. The woods of Pine Hollow had never been so alive with light. Dozens of lanterns bobbed through the trees as the townsfolk followed Sheriff Doyle into the darkness. Their boots crunched over fallen leaves, rifles clutched tightly in their hands. Fear had pushed them for weeks, but now anger drove them. The stranger had taken Lucy Harper, and no one was willing to wait any longer. Sheriff Doyle walked at the front, his face set and grim. Deputy Reed and Miller flanked him, their eyes scanning the shadows. The forest seemed to close in around them, every rustle of branches and cry of an owl making hearts race. "Keep your voices low," Doyle ordered. "We don't want to scare him off." But even as he spoke, Doyle wondered if it was already too late. The stranger had been one step ahead from the beginning. If he truly had Lucy, then the girl's life was in danger. The group fanned out, moving deeper into the woods. After an hour, one of the men called out, "Sheriff, over here!" The crowd gathered around. On the ground lay Lucy's small shoe caught in the mud. Mrs. Harper, who had insisted on joining the search, broke down in tears. Doyle picked up the shoe, his jaw tight. "He's close," the sheriff said. The men pressed forward. The forest grew thicker, branches clawing at their clothes. Soon they came upon a clearing. In the center stood the shack Doyle had found before, but now it looked different. The door was wide open and smoke curled faintly from the chimney. Doyle raised his hand. "Careful. He could be inside." Two men crept forward and pushed the door open. The shack was empty. A lantern burned weakly in the corner, casting a pale glow over the small room. On the floor lay Lucy's ribbon tied into a knot. Mrs. Harper gasped. "He had her here," she cried. Doyle examined the room. The blanket was still warm. The stranger had left only minutes before. "He's watching us," Doyle muttered. "He knows we're here." The men searched the shack, overturning boxes and lifting floorboards. Beneath one loose plank, they found another small wooden box. Inside were more strange trophies: a rusted watch, a faded photograph of a young boy, and a necklace with initials carved into the pendant. Deputy Miller's voice was low. "He's been keeping things from his victims." The sheriff closed the box and stood. "This is proof enough. We're dealing with a man who's dangerous, who's hurt people before, and now he's taken one of our own." The group pressed on. Deeper and deeper they went, lanterns swinging, rifles ready. The woods seemed endless, the silence heavy with tension. Every few minutes, someone thought they saw movement. A flicker of a shadow, the glint of eyes in the dark. But each time it vanished. Suddenly, a scream cut through the night. High, sharp, and full of terror, Mrs. Harper's face went pale. "Lucy!" she cried. The men broke into a run, crashing through the underbrush toward the sound. Doyle's heart pounded in his chest. They burst into another clearing and stopped short. At the far edge stood the stranger, tall, thin, and ragged, his face half hidden in the shadows. His clothes hung loose on his body, his hair long and wild. In his hand, he held Lucy by the arm. Her face was streaked with tears, but she was alive. "Don't move," Doyle shouted, raising his rifle. The other men did the same, forming a circle. The stranger's eyes glinted in the lantern light. For a long moment, he stood perfectly still, his grip on Lucy tight. Then, in a low, rasping voice, he spoke. "You don't understand," he said. "I never meant to hurt her." "But I can't let you take me." Doyle stepped forward slowly. "Let her go. Whatever you've done, we'll deal with it." "But let the girl go." The stranger shook his head. "You think you know who I am? You don't. They never proved anything. I've been running all my life." "The woods are the only place that listens," Lucy whimpered. Doyle's voice hardened. "If you want to keep running, then you'll have to go through all of us. This ends tonight." For a long moment, no one moved. The air was thick with silence, every lantern flickering in the dark. Then slowly, the stranger loosened his grip. Lucy broke free and ran to her mother, who pulled her into her arms, sobbing with relief. But the stranger didn't flee. Instead, he looked at Doyle, his eyes full of something strange. Anger, but also sorrow. "You think you're saving this town," he said. "But you don't know what I've buried here. You don't know the truth." Before Doyle could answer, the stranger turned and darted into the woods. "After him!" Doyle shouted. The men gave chase, their lanterns swinging wildly as they plunged into the trees. Branches whipped their faces. Roots caught their boots, but they pushed forward, following the sound of snapping twigs and heavy breaths. The chase led them deeper than anyone had ever gone, to a part of the forest that felt ancient and untouched. At last, the stranger stumbled into a ravine. He stopped, cornered by steep cliffs on either side. The men surrounded him, rifles raised. His chest heaved, his eyes wild. "You don't know what you're doing," he said. "The woods hold my sins. If you dig, you'll find them." "Then it's over," Doyle said firmly. "You'll face justice for whatever you've done." The stranger looked around as if searching for escape. Then his shoulders slumped. For the first time, he looked less like a monster and more like a broken man. "You'll regret finding me," he whispered. "The truth isn't what you think." The men moved in, ropes ready. The stranger didn't resist as they bound his hands, but even as they led him back through the forest, Doyle's mind was heavy with questions. What had he buried in these woods? What secrets did the notebook hide? And what did he mean by the truth isn't what you think? The stranger was caught, but Doyle knew the mystery was far from over. For Pine Hollow, the darkest part of the story was yet to come. The stranger was finally in custody. The people of Pine Hollow gathered outside the sheriff's office as dawn broke, their breath hanging in the cold air. For weeks they had lived in fear of shadows. Now the man who haunted their nights was tied with ropes and locked in the small holding cell. Lucy Harper was safe, clinging to her mother. But the relief did not erase the questions. Who was this man? Why had he been watching them? And what was the truth he claimed to have buried in the woods? Sheriff Doyle sat at his desk, the notebook open before him. The stranger, now revealed as Daniel Price, sat silently in the cell, his face pale and his eyes hollow. He didn't speak, not even when men shouted questions at him from outside. Doyle entered the cell with Deputy Reed and set the notebook on the table. "You've been hiding a long time," Doyle said evenly. "It's over now. But if you want any peace, you'll tell us what you've done." For a long time, Daniel said nothing. Then his voice cracked, low and tired. "They all believed I killed that man in Fairview. I didn't. I was there, yes. I saw everything. But I wasn't the one with the knife." Doyle's brow furrowed. "Then who was?" Daniel's eyes shifted to the floor. "A man I trusted. We planned the robbery together, but when things went wrong, he turned on me. He killed the clerk. I ran. By the time I realized what had happened, it was too late. The law wanted me, not him. So I disappeared." Reed crossed his arms. "That doesn't explain the clippings. The trophies. The child's shoe." Daniel's head dropped into his hands. "The shoe wasn't mine. I found it years ago in another part of the woods. I kept it because it reminded me I wasn't the only monster hiding. The necklace, the watch, those weren't my crimes. I collected them because I wanted proof. Proof that others had done worse than me. But no one would have believed me if I came back. So I stayed in the shadows." The sheriff studied him closely. Was this a confession or a desperate lie? He remembered Daniel's words in the clearing. "You don't know what I've buried here. Show me," Doyle said finally. "Take me to what you buried." That evening, under heavy guard, Daniel led the sheriff and his deputies into the woods. The townsfolk followed at a distance, lanterns flickering like stars in the night. Deeper and deeper they went, until Daniel stopped at a patch of earth near a fallen oak. He knelt, his hands shaking, and pointed. "Here," the deputies dug. After a few minutes, their shovels struck wood. They unearthed a large wooden chest, its sides damp and rotting. When they pried it open, the crowd gasped. Inside were more items, old purses, photographs, pieces of jewelry, even torn scraps of clothing. Each item carried the weight of a story, a life touched by violence. "These belonged to the victims," Daniel whispered. "Not mine. The real killer hid them here. He's the one who framed me." But no one believed me then. So I stayed silent. And I stayed hidden. Doyle examined the chest carefully. The objects were old but real. If Daniel was telling the truth, then someone else had committed crimes far worse than anyone realized. Someone who might still be out there. The townsfolk stood in stunned silence. Some muttered that Daniel was lying, twisting the truth to save himself. Others weren't sure anymore. The woods had hidden too many secrets, and the line between guilt and innocence was blurred. Back at the sheriff's office, Doyle pressed Daniel harder. "If you didn't do these things, why take Lucy?" Daniel's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't want to hurt her. I just wanted someone to listen. I knew if I took her, you'd all finally pay attention. I wanted to show you the truth, that I'm not the only one the woods protected." Doyle felt a heaviness in his chest. Daniel was guilty of kidnapping, of hiding, of letting fear consume him. But was he guilty of murder? Or was he a broken man trapped in a story that had followed him for years? The town demanded justice. Some shouted for Daniel to be hanged. Others said he should face trial in Fairview, where his story began. Doyle stood between them, torn between duty and doubt. As the days passed, the chest of buried items was sent to the county authorities. Investigators promised to reopen old cases, to study each piece carefully. Whether Daniel Price was the killer or not, his discovery would shed light on forgotten crimes. For Pine Hollow, the stranger in the woods was gone. But the fear he left behind lingered. Children still avoided the trees. Families still locked their doors early. The woods, once ordinary, now felt like a graveyard of secrets. On the last night before Daniel was taken away, Doyle stood by the cell door. Daniel looked up, his eyes hollow but calmer than before. "You'll never really know, will you?" Daniel asked softly. Doyle's jaw tightened. "Maybe not. But I know this. You terrorized my town. You may say you didn't kill, but you brought fear here. And fear is its own kind of crime." Daniel gave a small, broken smile. "Maybe you're right. Maybe the woods made me into the monster you all saw." When the wagon carried him away the next morning, Pine Hollow gathered in silence. Some cheered, others prayed, but most simply watched, uncertain if true justice had been served. The sheriff turned toward the forest, its shadows deep and endless. He knew the story wasn't finished. The woods still held secrets, and Daniel's words echoed in his mind. The truth isn't what you think. Pine Hollow would move on, but it would never forget. The stranger in the woods had changed everything, and some mysteries would remain buried forever. You've just seen another chilling story from the world of true crime, but there are many more secrets waiting to be uncovered. Subscribe to Crime Loom, and join us at